Writing is about the process. It's about listening and recognizing remnants of your story in the stories of others. When we share our stories with each other, we share the resonance of the human experience. The By Firelight podcast is your invitation to join our circle, a circle of writers, poets, seekers, and storytellers as we capture our living in words. This multifaceted living with joy, grief, love, growth, and loss is shared among us in your legacy, your story. The things you choose to do with your days as they unfold matter here. I'm your host, Betsy Delzer. I'm many things, but in this gathering, I'm a painter, poet, and writer, and I'm honored to be your guide through these episodes. Together, we'll find our muses in the rich and heart-expanding conversations with incredible guests, many who are like minds and all outrageously inspiring hearts. When you press play, you're here in the circle to share this space with us. By Firelight.
Jo Mercer grew up in Wisconsin, where she walked home from school with her head in a book, filled notebooks with stories in junior high, then went to college for accounting and psychology, only to open a dog daycare. She now writes and edits full-time. Her novel, In One Life and Out Another, was a finalist for the Forward Indies Book of the Year awards. Triplicity won a Moonbeam Silver, and Shady Woods received a perfect score from the Book Life Prize, an indie arm of Publishers Weekly. Well, Jo Mercer, we are so excited to have you on the show today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
As a form of introducing yourself to this platform and our listeners, I would just love to know what your younger or older self might want us to know or to tell us today.
That is a really tough question, actually. And pausing because I want everyone to know that you gave me this question ahead of time. But I've been thinking about this a lot. And I mean, my 77-year-old self hopefully will have all sorts of things to tell me that I have no idea of yet. Right? Like, I hope I am a wiser human at that point that I don't even know what I would say to myself. And my 7-year-old self, maybe I took this too literally, but I was like thinking about where I was when I was 7, what was happening in my life at 7. And I am sure that she doesn't have very many thoughts about the future. So I don't know. I mean, something brilliant that, I'll share with you when I'm 77, I guess.
Yeah, hopefully. I love that. Well, I'm curious if your 7-year-old self had dreams of the life that you're currently living. Do you think she had a picture of anything that you're doing or living in the world right now?
I was very into books. All of my childhood, I walked home from school with my head in a book. Like, I would read while I was walking home from school. So at that age, I feel like my world was so small and I didn't have any idea that that would be something I could do. And even when I started writing for fun in like junior high and middle school, I would babysit. And after the kids went to sleep, I would write in a notebook. Even then, for whatever reason, whatever frame, wherever I was growing up, I never thought, I could do this for the rest of my life. To me, a job was something much less creative and more practical. So I got a late start on the actual writing for publication.
Yeah. Let's build a little bit of the framework of life because you didn't launch right into writing. Tell us a little bit about what you end up pursuing early adulthood, which would have been close to the time that you and I first connected.
Right. So I started school thinking I was going to be a psychologist. So that sort of plays into writing a little bit, like people and relationships. And then I just decided I didn't want to go to get my PhD. I didn't want to be in school that long. So I switched to accounting, which I know totally other side of the brain. And before I even graduated, I had met my husband and we opened a dog daycare. So we owned and operated a dog daycare for 22 years. And I was maybe just getting back into writing again when we met because our daughters were 3, 4.
Yeah, it's around like 16 years that we've been connected. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right. So I started writing when my youngest was born. So probably just when we met, I was writing again. And I was at home with the kids and my brain was stir crazy. So it sort of came back to me. Like, what did I do when I was younger with my time? I mean, there's a lot of time that you're using to take care of babies, but your brain's not doing a whole lot. And so I sort of just started daydreaming again and started typing during naps and then typing with Aubrey on my lap. And so it just came back in a big rush. And then at that point I was like, well, why can't I do this? So it took me being an adult to, I guess, give myself the permission to pursue something creative. And then that sort of built as our business built. And then, side by side, did both for a while.
I know that there are some people, just based on some feedback we're getting from people who are listening, that are like, how does this happen? Like what, how do we go from babies on laps to published books, right? So let's go into a little bit of, first of all, you are a fiction writer, a young adult fiction writer. Did you know that? Or did you start with multiple types of writing? Or did you kind of always have an idea of where you were headed?
No, I did not have an idea. I actually started writing young adult paranormal because it was when Twilight was huge. And I was like, okay, well, I'll just try this. When I was younger, I wrote, I would say young adult realistic fiction because that's what I was doing. So realistic and contemporary, same thing. I mean, the kids at school call it realistic fiction, I guess. So sometimes I interchange. So because paranormal was so big, that's what I started writing. Those books are now the Shady Wood series, which are all complete and out, published. They're shorter, easy to read, sort of geared towards a reluctant reader. And I hadn't spent my life reading paranormal. I read all over the place. So I think as a writer, I started writing all over the place. And I do think that if you don't know, like if you are not a person who's only been reading one genre your entire life and that's what you want to write, I do think you should give yourself some time to play around. And you can do multiple things, but it is definitely harder to market yourself as an author who writes a lot of stuff, because if someone's reading your young adult paranormal, they're not necessarily going to want to read your adult contemporary. That's not necessarily the same reader. So just from a practical standpoint, playing around with things. In the beginning, it was just sort of what idea came to my head and what would that play out as. So after I wrote the Shady Woods series, I wrote a young adult contemporary at the same time that I wrote a romantic suspense adult novel. And then I wrote a family drama after that. So the themes came to me first, and then the characters, and like, what kind of story does that fit? You can't always force something into young adult, right? So yeah, I think take some time to get to know yourself as a writer before you commit to too much.
Yeah. And I love that connection of like knowing yourself as a reader as well, because I'm personalizing and thinking, I've definitely always been in the self-help section of bookstores and stuff since I was in high school. So I can just really connect to this concept of like, maybe I envision publishing what I have most spent time reading, right? What I'm curious about as it relates to your storylines is I was thinking about you, and I was thinking about, we've always had a connection around art. In fact, besides our daughters, we have connected on multiple different art forms. But Michelangelo used to look at something and then he would allow the sculpture to emerge, or he would allow the painting to kind of come to life. Is it like that with your final pieces, your final works? Like, do you feel like it was there and you're just kind of like unpacking it? Or is it a building that is like a relationship with the themes and the characters? Like, can you talk about that a little bit? I'm so curious.
Yes, I think that it is a building and a give and take. And definitely it has a mind of its own once you get going. And there have been many times where I had an intent for a manuscript and that intent didn't necessarily end up working. And then the characters were like, no, this is what we're doing. Thanks. And so it definitely becomes its own living, breathing thing. And I believe that you can either take the path of forcing it into what you want it to be, and maybe you can effectively force it there. I'm not really much of a person who likes to force things too terribly much. So I prefer to let it take shape and see how it comes out. And there's been times where that intent then I carried over to another manuscript. Like, well, maybe my intent will work for this other story, even though it didn't for this first story. I think a lot of stuff comes from the subconscious too. I think a lot of work comes from the subconscious. While you're sleeping, while you're living, you feed seeds into your brain as you're thinking about what aspects of the book you want. Like, for instance, one of my stories was inspired by my girls when they were really young. My daughter, my youngest, was like 3 years old and just miserable that her chalk drawing was not as good as her sister's. And this was like such an innate, like, she was just comparing herself to her sister, who was 2 years older than her. And she was like 50% older. Like that's a ton of living at that age. And it was just so natural for her to want to be like her older sister that played into this whole theme of my book. So you feed your brain those seeds, but I don't have the characters yet. I don't have the story. I'm not writing a picture book about a 3 and 5-year-old. That's not where I was going with that, you know? So I do think sometimes letting that percolate, you know, you go on Pinterest and you look up visuals that inspire you, or you hear a song that inspires you, and it just sort of slowly comes together. And, you know, plotters tend to be much more intentional about that, making notes, thinking about plot constructs and what will come next if this is what I'm doing. But even so, when you go to sleep at night, I think a lot of times that subconscious is doing all sorts of work for you and tends to show up. And maybe that's it. Maybe it's more your subconscious is saying, no, this isn't the book you're writing. This is the book you're writing.
I'm fascinated by this attention that we're spending on the subconscious for lots and lots of reasons. But I'm wondering, is that where a lot of your ideas come? Like, do you wake with a jolt? Do things come to you in the middle of the night? What is that like?
That has happened to me, not a ton. I think a lot of times I start with theme or something will bother me in the world or society. I've actually more recently been writing more fantasy and kind of adult fantasy. And a lot of the themes are more like, society is a beast that does not seem to be able to be tamed even by our collective conscious, even if we want to. And so that inspires me about how society could look or pulling certain things. You know, I feel like today in America, we have so much choice, so much choice. And like, what does that choice do? You know, if you have too much choice, if you have no choice, like, what does that look like? Like pulling threads out and using them to birth a story or a world.
The subconscious revealing ideas. Is there anything that you do or you practice? Are you like a meditator, or is there something that you do to try to access or make that channel like a little more clear?
I think a lot of people do. I know people who have a notebook at the side of their bed so they can make notes as soon as they wake up in the morning. I have a writer friend who writes down every dream she remembers in the morning, every single dream, so that a lot of her books have been spawned by that. I am not that intentional. I am a much more, I would say, like gut instinct kind of mover, worker. But I will stop and allow my subconscious to do the work when I feel like I am hitting a wall. I would say more so like in revisions, or if in the middle of drafting a novel, I get stuck and I don't know where it's going. I will like consciously think about it to some extent, obviously. But if I just feel like I'm, you know, coming up against a wall, I will just hands off. I like make the conscious effort, like, okay, subconscious, your turn for a little bit. I'm going to go live life and read books and maybe work on something else and hope that in a few weeks you're going to come back to me with an answer. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it takes longer than a few weeks. I have put manuscripts aside and sometimes due to life for a lot longer than that, but it generally comes through for me. So far, so good.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'd like to go in kind of two directions. So I want to talk a little bit about that wall that you mentioned and following the thread and then getting kind of hooked somewhere and pausing. But I also want you to think about revealing to us a time when, you know, you said the characters almost like have a voice of their own, or, you know, they speak to you and say, this is what we're doing, you know? So I do want to kind of explore both directions. So which direction do you want to go first? Because I'm so curious about either one.
We can do the wall first, I guess.
Okay. So I'm curious just what it feels like. Like, are you sitting at your workstation and you're writing and then you just are like, I just can't, like, what happens in your writing process?
Yes. I mean, I would think, yes. Generally, there is a very easy flow. And sometimes when I sit down, it takes a little bit to get into that flow. But that's the fun of writing to me. And that's why I write. Like, it was born as a love, not as a job, right? So I don't want it to turn into something that I'm fighting with. So I will be writing and sometimes I'm just like, this doesn't feel right. I don't know where to go from here. And I do try to write very much in like cause and effect. And I do plot a fair amount. But even so, like this, I guess the sort of both of those threads come together because sometimes I will have plotted something and I know where I should be going, but the character, the story is like, this doesn't feel right. the character you've written me to be up till now would not do this thing that you had me doing. So then what would that character do? And I also, like, again, with the not forcing things, I want my stories to feel natural, like they unfold inevitably. And I feel like if I am pushing things and trying to smash pieces together to make them work, that's not how the reader's going to read it. So yes, I will just sit there and get frustrated or feel yucky. Like not yucky, but like, oh, I guess probably frustrated. And I don't know where I'm going. I can force myself to write something. And yes, I mean, sometimes I will force myself to write something and maybe the next day it'll be like, oh no, okay, this gives me an idea. Like I can go here. But sometimes it's just like day after day, I'm sitting down and I don't feel good about it. There's no flow. And I'm not saying, I would like to put the caveat that please, writers who are starting out, you will have to make yourself write sometimes. There's not always a flow right away. It's not always wonderful. It is a beast of a thing to do. But if you just feel like you're not making any movement, or the movement that you're making is not feeling like brainstorming, but it's just feeling like a bunch of crap and it's not putting you in a good place, then, walk away. Like sometimes our brains get overloaded and overwhelmed, and sometimes life is overwhelming. And I do think that's the tricky part of being a creative, is that I feel like you have to be able to create a space for your brain to be free of that life overwhelm in order to do creative work. And so life is always going to be there. So now I've taken that in a totally different direction.
I love the direction. You just said something that I was like, ooh, like that's the nerve spot, right? Is that life, that overwhelm and that dance that we have it's such a part of the process. So you hit this space and it sounds like you give yourself some grace and I'm even hearing like just some compassion around the ability to pause, right? Because this is not a job, this is your love. And so you'll put that away for a while, and then does it tap you or do you tap back in to begin again?
I would say both of those things could happen. I mean, I do think, I will just randomly in the middle of doing absolutely whatever, sometimes be like, oh, this is it. This is where I'm going. Or I will, again, read a book, and not that I'm taking a plot from there, or watch TV or hear a song or watch something in my children's life and be like, oh, I could do that with this thing, And so sometimes it will tap me on the shoulder, and sometimes it's been too long and I'm antsy and I'm like, okay, I need to try this again. And I'll sit back down and wrestle with it a little bit and pull it out. So both have happened. I mean, I have written probably 15 to 20 books at this point. So, it's all happened. It's all happened for me.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you feel like we adequately went the other direction of the character emerging in that flow in what we just talked about? Or do you want to spend a little bit more time there?
It seems simple to me. Maybe it doesn't seem simple to someone who's not been in it. But yes, let me try to give another example. And this is maybe more the story than the character, but I wanted to write a book in which there was 2 points of view. And one of the points of view wanted, like every character wants something, right? So your 2 main points of view want something both very much, and they are conflicting. So they can't both in the end have what they want because it's directly related. And I wanted them to create a relationship throughout the story in which, of course, that would be miserable for both of them to then either get what they want or not get what they want, because they still want the thing, but they want this person who they've come to care about also to get the thing. That's been the hardest thing for me to try to actually write out and have it work. So the way that it ended up writing was that in the beginning of the story, that was like, he needs her help. And she absolutely, of course, is not going to do that. That's not what she would ever do. She doesn't want to have any part of that part of her life kind of a thing, though she needs to. So this is the problem, right? So like he actually can help her if she helps him, and it's something she needs but doesn't want. So I was going to write it as a duology, or I was going to write it as a standalone. And then when I got to about 70 or 80,000 words, which is about your YA novel length, I was like, oh, maybe this needs to be 2 books. And I have since decided to go back and write it as an adult fantasy in which it can be longer. So I haven't actually finished it yet. So maybe I will succeed. Maybe this is one of those things where like I had to put it aside because I wasn't the writer that could do that. But as it stands now, they're in it together.
Mm.
And so I'm not sure how to make it in the end that they can't both have what they want. We'll see.
Yeah, the dance of the character living and then you're also creating simultaneously. That is a fascinating concept. Can you just tell us a little bit about your publishing life and experience? Have you self-published? Do you publish with someone or some other entity?
I spent many years querying. I started querying when you sent in an actual paper letter to people, right? You do not do that anymore. A lot of agents don't even take emails. They have a form that you fill out, and it's like a whole query application thing. So I queried a lot, and I definitely think I queried before I was ready, before my stories were ready. I was essentially self-taught. So it takes a while to teach yourself, right? When I was about to turn 40, not to age myself, but like I said earlier, I had a romantic suspense novel, adult, and I had a, not adult like erotica, just for adults. And I had a family drama. And I was at that point pretty much only writing. So like you had asked me earlier, how did I pick a genre? At that point, I was like, well, I'm going to write young adult for the rest of my life. I'm going to write young adult contemporary for the rest of my life is what I thought at the time. And so I was like, well, if I query this romantic suspense novel, that agent, if they liked it, they're going to want me to write a bunch of romantic suspense novels. That's what they're going to want to market me as in the marketplace. And I really didn't want to do that. So I was like, well, I'm turning 40. Like, what if I just self-publish this? And that's one reason why I picked a pen name. So I think it was J.K. Rowling and Stephanie Meyer both wrote adult novels. And being a fan of theirs, I think J.K. Rowling used a pen name and Stephanie Meyer did not. And Stephanie Meyer did a better job of keeping it feeling the same as Twilight, I guess. But like J.K. Rowling, I just was not into her adult novels. Sorry, I maybe shouldn't say that publicly. But it was like Harry Potter was so different and such a machine than what else she was writing. So it made sense to have a pen name. And I was like, that does make sense. Like, I don't want people to like pick up something that they feel like is going to feel the same way. And it feels completely different. So that's why I kept my real name as something that I would still maybe traditionally publish as. So anyway, getting ahead of myself a little bit. So I took Dark and Stormy as my debut novel and, you know, this romantic suspense that I never thought. I read a ton of suspense novels. Before I had kids, I watched a ton of like, you know, CSI and all that kind of stuff. And when I had kids, I had a lot harder time watching and reading that because I turned into a paranoid mom, I guess. So I think that was another reason where I was like, well, I'm not going to write that stuff anymore. So I had so much more fun than I thought I would in the process. And it was sort of one of those kismet things too, because I was like, well, I'm never going to find a cover designer. I don't even know what I want for the cover. Like, that's probably not just really a good idea. And I woke up the next morning and I went on Pinterest and I was looking at art and I found that like ink, it's like you drop ink into water and this guy on Pinterest, like, I don't know if you can even still do this on Pinterest, but at the time I was able to find his email and say, hey, have you ever done book covers? Like, would you do a book cover? Like, what's the cost? Like, I probably way out of my price range. And he was like, yes, I actually just recently did some work for, I think, HarperCollins. And I understand that indies don't have the same kind of budget. I would do it for, you know, XYZ. And it was like one of those things where I really thought this was going to be a barrier and it 100% wasn't. So I took that as a sign to just go ahead and do it. Right. So I published that, had a lot more fun having the control that you don't have when you're with a big publisher. And because of my experience with that, and because I was writing YA contemporary, I went ahead and then published the family drama. And so then I'm, you know, writing along and I'm like, well, do I want to publish more? I'm like, I'm enjoying this, you know? And I think at that point I started writing fantasy. So even though I had assumed that I would stick to YA contemporary, I switched to fantasy. And there's some things I don't read and I don't write them, but I do tend to read all over the map. So I did feel like a lot of my YA contemporary novels read the same, had the same sort of feel as you're reading them. You know, the fantasy has more complicated sentences, obviously more world building and stuff like that. So it still felt like it would work under the J. Mercer brand, so to speak, as which, you know, the YA paranormal, then I have ultimately put out under the J. Mercer brand as well. And I feel like the language is the same. So that's how I differentiated. And I actually am now with my fantasy querying again under my real name, sort of giving that fantasy a shot that the contemporary did have.
Awesome. And this is a good segue into talking about your pen name and just kind of the decisions that you made along the way and how and why you arrived there at J. Mercer.
Yes. So Mercer is the play on my maiden name. So I have to say, I'm not sure if I did it again, I would pick an initial, because sometimes then people are like, well, what do I call you? And they call me Jay. And I'm like, okay, I don't know how to sign my emails. So think about that if you're picking a pen name, anyone out there. But yeah, I think when I published the romantic suspense, I still wanted to query my YA fantasy. And at the time, agents were not picking up self-published authors of the same name. Like they would have published my new, like if I pitched them a YA novel, they would publish that and maybe under the same name that I was already using, but they wouldn't want anything to do with the self-pub that was already out. And I do think it was an easier sell to take a fresh author who hadn't had history. Now it's much more common to be self-published. There's a lot of self-pub authors who started that way and now are humongous. I'm pretty positive Colleen Hoover was self-pub and just like got so much momentum that, you know, the publishers wanted her and she got an agent and went even bigger. And I think some agents will rep someone under the same name, that self-pub, and maybe take your books with you. And some don't want to. So they'll tell you now if they want to or they don't want to. But at the time I wanted to save a name, so to speak, for traditional publication. I also chose a pen name with my first novel because it was spicier than, here's another example of a time that a character took over a little bit. But it's a romantic suspense novel. One of the points of view swears a whole lot and a lot of F words. And I mean, I have like taken a lot of them out, but I do not swear. And I was sort of like, I'm not sure how I feel about putting this out there under my real name or with my kids, you know, who were at that point young, but if they ever ran across it, which at this point the secret's out. But there were a few times when I went back to the manuscript and tried to take every F word out. I was like, I'm not going to have swear words. Like it doesn't need to be swear words. And he was just like, no, I don't talk like that. I do not talk like that. It does not feel natural. I am not like, you are leaving these in. You are leaving as many in that you can handle. So I left them in. And so it was also like not, you know, my YA contemporary was, you know, there are actually a few swear words in them, but the romantic suspense is a little spicy. It's not open door, but it's definitely more than the YA. And so for all those reasons, I just wasn't ready to commit to putting my real name on that. I think today I would. I think I'm a more mature person and more comfortable with my writing, maybe. But I think I still would have chosen a pen name because, again, I was like saving this for a different kind of writing, for a different brand, right? I'm saving my current real name for a different brand of book. So, yeah.
I want to spend a little bit of time thinking about maybe like the book that you feel most connected to. Is there one that I know that I can imagine getting through the process and like hearing you talk about the development of characters, the development of story, the building, the creating. I imagine that you kind of get to a place where once you're reading through the end of the revisions and whatnot, whereas there's this sense of completion or birth, right? But I also can imagine that there might be one that you're like, yes, like I'm so proud of this, or this is something I'm so glad that I brought to this world. I know that there might be many that are coming to mind, but is there one that you're like, this is my holy yes?
Yes, but also, so that's an interesting question because my first answer would be that every newest book is that. Every newest book is like, this is the best one. This is the one. And then my second answer is that the first fantasy novel I wrote, which is currently titled Bonefire and Starlight, and it's not out anywhere, it's not published yet. That was a novel that I had some ideas for a really long time ago, and I did not feel like I could write it well enough at the time. So I was like just sitting and waiting and sitting. And when I wrote that, I was like, this is my magnum opus. Like, I'm never going to write anything better than this. This is it. Like, and it was interesting. I don't feel like I got too stuck on that. There's a chance of being like stuck on that and being like, well, I'm never going to write anything again then, but I was just like, well, that's just like the best it's going to get. And that's okay. Like, I'll go on and write other stories and whatever. And indeed, I wrote 3 other stories after that, 3 other fantasy novels after that. And I was like, yeah, that one is still the one that I am the most proud of and the one that I'm the most connected to. And maybe because it was my first fantasy, I think the world building is more otherworldly. The ones I wrote after that are a little bit more accessible to our current world. It's sort of a folksy, like village fantasy. The powers are more like natural. It's hard to explain. Anyway, not going to get super into that. But the most recent book that I just wrote, now I feel like, okay, this one might be better than that one. So, don't give up. Don't sell yourself short. And am I happy with the books I wrote between? Yes, I am. But I'm maybe not as connected to them. Yeah.
So we, at the beginning of this conversation, did a little bit of like the time travel play of like older, younger self. We're 16 years into this relationship of our friendship and connection. And you have, did you say 15 to 20 books you've published? Or written?
Or written, yes.
Written. Okay. So if you go back just, a decade and a half, what is the wisdom you now know about that process of 15 to 20 manuscripts, books, publishing? Like, what would you tell her? Because we definitely stood in line at preschool with your like query conversation and paper in your hands,
Yes. I would tell her that it is a long and winding road and that what pays off is patience, which was hard for me to work on, patience and perseverance. Like, you do have to be diligent. You do have to be disciplined. You do also at the same time, which sometimes feels contrary, you have to be kind to yourself and give yourself the space to take a break when the diligence and discipline are too much and don't feel like they're paying off, right? Yeah, I think it's not easy. And so you definitely have to do it because you love it and you can't imagine doing anything else. And to also hold on to the joy of it, to make sure you hold on to the joy of it while you started in the first place.
Okay, so you brought some things to share perhaps or to read. What would you like to read for us first?
Yes. So way back, however many years ago, you had invited me to a spill, which I think you kind of explained your spills in the last episode. And as a fiction writer, I was like, I don't know what I'm going to journal, but I was working on my romantic suspense, which was my debut novel. And so one of your prompts, I just like put myself in Farron's brain and journaled as Farron. Now, it doesn't sound like a journal at this point because I've, changed it to fiction, but I believe that this like opening, there's some like sentences that came from that spell. I'm going to read the prologue first, which is Kai's point of view. And there's no swear words in this, so you don't have to worry about censoring me. But so me to jump in? Yeah.
Jump in.
Okay. So the opening is Kai sank his hands deep in the snow until his flesh burned, hoping the cold would freeze out the fire seething inside. He sank them further until they were hidden beneath the white, until it seemed he lost them altogether. This was no surprise, as he'd lost everything when he lost her. The voice beside him, reading him his rights, came in and out on the icy breeze, but Kai didn't hear the words. What he heard was the echo behind them of what his life should have been. He should have had Farron. He should have had a house and a family. He'd been so close to finally considering himself a good human being and respected. But a house, a family, respect, none of these things would happen for him now, innocent or not. The truth didn't matter at this point, whether he'd done it. What mattered was the policeman pulling him away from her grave. What mattered was the blood on his hands. So that's the prologue. And then her opening chapter starts before that timeline, obviously. Sometimes I felt wild and restless, like a Mustang that turns around one day and realizes it's been domesticated, when all it thought it did was take the offer of a simple apple. It always started the same way, from a point deep in my center, and would grow to an incessant itch I couldn't shake. To soothe it, I'd been driving for days, all my belongings stacked high behind me in my small SUV. The ones I'd seen as necessities anyway, since my goal was to pare back and succumb to basic need. I yearned for amnesia to settle in my mind and recreate me into who I was supposed to be, because at 33 I didn't know anymore. I'd been so many things, so very split and so widely scattered. If I chased solitude and eliminated distractions, I figured my true self would have no choice but to rise from the ashes of all the other roles I'd spent my life playing. And if it did, maybe I could go back home and survive the future, whether that entailed the path I'd been on or a new one altogether.
So how is that the connection to the journaling? What do you remember the prompt that kind of wove its way in?
I don't. I wonder if I have the notebook still, actually.
You're like, stage right.
No, I actually think. Oh, okay. Well, I have not read this, but this might be. Does this sound familiar to you? The beginnings and endings of all human undertakings are untidy.
I mean, maybe.
I mean, it was probably 10 years ago. I am pretty sure this is the exact notebook that I brought to this coffee shop. You want me to read it?
Yeah.
I have no idea if it's.
I mean, you leap if you want to take us. I'm here for it.
Oh, or maybe great is the art of beginning, but greater is the art of ending. I think because didn't you used to bring multiple quotes that were all sort of related?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think this is it. The beginnings and endings of all human undertakings are untidy. We are not linear, uncomplicated units. We are messy with branches, and my limbs are reaching to his. If life was linear, if we were linear, my parents wouldn't have died. I wouldn't have had to raise my siblings. I wouldn't have hated and loved every minute of that life. But I was not linear and uncomplicated. I was split in so many ways, I couldn't even keep track. It's sort of scratches and messy. Grief that settled like a sticky mesh across our senses. We clung to it at first, held its strong but wispy tendrils to our hearts to remember them, to remember us and how clear everything seemed back when it was all linear. So then, yeah, there's a few more pages of some from other. Oh, it looks like I might have even written Kai's prologue that night also.
I love that. Oh, I love that so much. The connection is beautiful. Is there anything else you want to read, or does that feel like it will suffice to give us a taste of you in the world?
Yeah, so I had pulled, because you had asked also about the evolution of me as a writer, I had pulled that because it felt right, being that I wrote it at your spill, and also that was my debut novel. And then, like I said, my evolution kind of moved to young adult. And so I will read this little opening to my novel, Perfection and Other Elusive Things. And I think you can just see the difference in the tone between the adult and young adult. And so, like, if you're a writer and you're trying to like figure out where you fit, I mean, a lot of that is your voice and your natural voice and how you're going to write. And obviously you can do both, but if there's one that you're very partial to, that might settle you in a certain genre. So this is the very beginning of this one. I took out a little bit of dialogue to keep it more spill-like, but the opening line is, I hid the school newspaper from my best friend. Billy wouldn't appreciate that I wasn't reading the news part of it, and she'd roll her eyes when she realized it was Hawk's words I was melting over. Him again, she'd say. Honestly, Eden, he's going to be working at a gas station for the rest of his life. Except we didn't even know if he worked at a gas station in the first place. Her point, of course, was that I wasn't the type of girl, that his words were perfection, and clearly he was more of an intellect than she took him for. Mr. Keller clapped, and I startled, crumpling the paper in my hands. I resisted the urge to smooth it on my thigh and draw attention to the fact that I wasn't listening in class, because, you guessed it, I also wasn't the type of girl to not listen in class. Frankly, I was pretty sick of being a girl like me. Girls like me did what they were supposed to. That's what I'd come to realize. Not what they wanted. Girls like Ivy did what they wanted, and, it seemed to me, seldom what they were supposed to. There had to be a happy medium. There had to be an in-between. So I think also I got into writing young adult to some extent. I mean, that's how I started, because I started writing as a teen. But I think my girls were getting older, and I was thinking about my childhood and society and what society teaches you and what I didn't want society to teach my children, which I think is an impossible feat, to not allow society to teach your children things, but how I intentionally wanted to like push back against that and stuff. So that's sort of what that book was born from.
Last question kind of about the writing piece, and then I just have one last exercise to close our time, okay? I'm curious, do you feel like with that, like where you were in your life as a mom now to teens, you've now kind of raised them as a writer, were you kind of parenting through the messages of your stories in some ways, like things that you wanted them to receive?
Yes, absolutely. And also, I think I actually said once 5 or 10 years ago that I think sometimes you write to teach yourself a lesson. I think that a lot of times people are, a lot of writers don't start with theme. I think I tend to start with theme, but a lot of times you write a story and then you kind of try and find the theme in it that you wrote about. And so I think whether consciously ahead of time or subconsciously through your writing, people are often grappling with something or not grappling, really strongly believe and want to put that into paper. But I do think sometimes I have worked out, life in my books.
Yeah, it's almost, I feel like you can craft the ideal in some ways, right? Like the ideal outcome, or you can craft the ending in a way that we really have to relinquish control to in the actual lived experience, right? And most of these questions, I will say for the listener, like I didn't really give you a framework for, so you've just done a brilliant job helping us understand your process. And I love your relationship with your stories. I think that's going to sit with me for a while. So thank you so much for that. So, all right, this is like stream of consciousness, quick write style of answering, where I'm just going to throw something towards you that I have not prepared you with yet. So if you were just to kind of just go with the first thought, the first thing I want to offer is I want people who read my work to know.
I want people who read my work to know that they are not alone, that there is a common human experience, that I believe whatever you're feeling, wherever you're at, whatever you're struggling with, you would be astounded how many other people out there are in the same place. And I think so often we, especially because we're such a communal being, I think that so often we don't want to talk about something, or we're afraid of revealing something because we believe that we're the only person that feels that way. And I think that's the beauty of books, is that, I'd be willing to bet that whatever you're feeling, you can find a book. If you look hard enough and wide enough, you can find a book that someone wrote that feeling into the pages. And I hope that it stands for, even if you don't meet the person in real life that feels the same way you do, that you know that you are connected and that you're not alone.
I love that. Beginning is most challenging because
of beginning is most challenging. Do I think beginning is that challenging? I feel like beginning is all play. If we're talking writing, is that what we're talking? We're actually talking about the act of writing.
It could be, if that's, yeah. I love this spin though.
Beginning. I mean, I feel like the beginning, everything is possible. The hope is in the air, right? Like the thing that I love about writing is you can't mess up a first draft, because it's never going to be perfect and you're always going to have to make changes. So there's a freedom there. If I were a sculptor, or a painter, I feel like you once you put that paint down, like, yes, you can change it and put stuff on top of it, but you can't take it away. So the beginning is the hardest part. I mean, maybe sometimes because of self-doubt, can you do what you're intending to do? And when you turn around at the end, will it look the same as you wanted it to? Maybe not. Then you have to just give yourself grace and move on, I guess.
Oh, that's so good. How about thinking about, because I was really considering how much it feels, and I mean, it not only feels, it is, that you've accomplished a lot as a writer. Thinking about this line, carrying out a vision is rewarding because, or when.
Carrying out a vision is rewarding because it is, this doesn't exactly make sense, but if I'm doing, like, first thing that comes to mind, because it is art, because it is beautiful, because it sings. I feel like I think that we spend so much time thinking about our dreams and our goals, or we don't, but we have a dream and a goal in mind. And a lot of times you can take steps, depending on how you frame your goals, right? But it doesn't always work out. You don't always get to where you want to go. So when you do get to where you want to go and you do carry out that vision, it is like, heart happy, like accomplishment, success, that kind of vibe.
Yeah. And what do you hope you're remembered by? I hope I'm remembered by.
I hope I'm remembered by how I made people feel and the energy that I bring to the room, which I couldn't necessarily even tell you what that is. But I think, was it maybe Maya Angelou who said, I have no idea who said this, but that people don't remember what you do for them or what you say, but how you made them feel. And I think that's what I'm doing with my books too. I think that's what writers are doing. Right? Like when I was really young, I wanted to be an actress, which is comical if you know me, because I really don't like to be front and center. But to me as a child, it was, I want to, like the way I feel after watching a movie, you know, that like renewed sense of hope or renewed sense of inspiration, or life can be good or life can be terrible, but it can also be good and it all works out okay, or, you know, whatever, or it doesn't, but you get through it. All those things that you get from the feeling of watching a movie. I wanted to like bring that to people, I guess. And so I think that translates the same in writing, right? That's sort of brings us back to your first question maybe, but that's, I guess, what I want to remember by.
I love that. What else do you want to share, or where can people find you? How can we follow your work and get a hold of the newest, greatest things that you birth and create?
Yes, I am most often on Instagram at J Mercer Books. And I also have a Facebook page at J Mercer Books. Everything is pretty much at J Mercer Books or www.jmercerbooks. So that's easy enough. I'm not on Facebook quite as often, and I am on Threads, but you can follow me there. I'm not sure you'll see anything. And I also have an Instagram account at by Joanna Hinsey, which is where I am putting my, you know, fantasy stuff at the moment. So
beautiful. Well, thank you so much for this time. And thank you, like heartfelt congratulations to the journey and sticking with it, the perseverance that has brought so much beauty to the world, and just the road ahead. I'm so excited to follow it and see all the things that you continue to create. It's really a wonderment for somebody who is kind of like tapped in and out of our lives together to see kind of where it's come and where you're going. So thank you for this time so much, Jo.
Thank you. Thank you for having me and your wonderful questions. You made this very easy.
Oh, good. Well, I have a feeling the people listening, hopefully they can reach us and know that they aren't alone, right? That's right. My intention for this podcast as well. So it's a continued theme that keeps coming up in these conversations. And so I think that's why we find ourselves here. So thank you.
Thank you.
By Firelight is a Lit Path Studios production and is produced by Jamie Gale and Betsy Delzer. Music is by Legito Music and Pond 5. Thank you for being a part of our beautiful collection of stories.